Cherell is a writer, lecturer, and speaker specializing in 19th century spiritualism. She's the creator and editor of burialsandbeyond.com, which I just mentioned, a website which seeks to make death, social, and paranormal history accessible to a wider audience. She currently, I don't know if it is still current, co-presenting the television show Jack Osborne's Haunted Homecoming. She also presents Loopholes, which is the podcast, which you'll be able to access through the Patreon as well, which covers the paranormal and unexplained. She maintains an interest in paranormal investigation, cemeteries, Victoriana, and good wine. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, the wonderful, illustrious, academic, charming, beautiful, and profoundly gothic Dr. Cherell. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What a hell of an introduction. Thank you. Thanks for popping in, everyone. Tonight, I'd like to talk to you about the sensuality of seance. So, as with everything, I am a girl who loves a good PowerPoint. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen and hope I don't have anything else dodgy open in another window. So please bear with me. There we go. Sharing. Okay, right. Can everyone see that top tier PowerPoint?
Yep.
Someone says yes, then.
Yep.
We're good? Excellent. Okay. Right, so we're going to be talking about not just the scent, but the importance of all the senses within the seance room and how that is conducive to an effective, in whatever way you see this, seance. So it'll be about an hour-ish. So far from being a simple belief system, modern spiritualism transformed the way in which many people interacted with the world, with much of that transformation taking place through the process of seance. In the home and in small rented rooms, mediums and believers alike could transcend social, cultural, and gender norms, allowing women more bodily autonomy, empowering the working classes, and inciting the dead to walk amongst us. Now, as many as you know, seance is an immersive and addictive experience where domestic spaces are transformed into these liminal spheres where each sense brings about a fresh and vulnerable experience, with the touch of a spirit's robe, the soft hand of a stranger, the smell of heavenly bouquets, the glimpse of a manifesting spirit, or the sound of hymns sung into darkness, all culminates in the heightened, unseen, and unspoken power of the seance room. Now, seance requires the shedding of the rational mind and the awakening of the senses. Now, while this talk will mainly be focusing on the medium-led seance, the most transformative experiences happen in the minds and the bodies of the sitters, rather than the individual who's producing the phenomena. Mediums are important and indivisible from the space and the feelings they create. However, their impact, their abilities and methodologies have a far greater reach and importance than their everyday identities. That isn't to say that we won't look at a handful of notable mediums, each with their own distinct and rather odd ways of conducting seance, but the seance room phenomena and impact of their actions on society and culture are far more wide-reaching. The medium's experience, intent, and control is separate from their creation. So while their audience enter a seance room governed by a new set of social and spiritual expectations, the medium's job is to spin several sensory plates, curating an environment suitable for perceived spirit contact. Now, while I touch on many aspects of seance and seance room usage in this talk, this isn't a thorough representation of all types of spiritualist phenomena, either in the 19th century or in today's spiritualist churches and paranormal groups. I have rather chosen to focus on a handful of common, powerful instances of intense sensual experiences, whether they be pleasant, unpleasant, or simply a bit weird. Also, a little more time will be afforded to olfaction and scent, because that's sort of the project that I'm trying to develop at the minute. So, since the birth of modern spiritualism in 1848, people from all genders and social backgrounds have attended seance rooms, each with their own reasons for attending. Working class spirit mediums would rent rooms and accept sittings for a few pennies, while more upwardly mobile mediums would practice their craft under the funding of a patron. Some of the more prominent historical figures would have personal mediums attending to their metaphysical needs for short periods, such as Queen Victoria and Abraham Lincoln, who, it's been argued, have attended several seances in search of spiritual guidance. And while we would regard grief or active mourning as playing a large role in the proliferation and the rise of popular spirit contact, most spiritualist communities and home circles grew from simple curiosity and an excitement about the possibilities within this new religion and new science of parapsychology. Trends in spiritualism came and went, and what was commonplace in the 1870s was dismissed and regarded as pretty old hat by the 1930s. However, to narrow our scope to a fixed era kind of deprives us of the rich, wider developments and experiences of spiritualist practitioners down the years. Now, in regards to belief or disbelief in the legitimacy of spectral phenomena, I will be taking a decidedly ambivalent viewpoint, presenting experiences and reports just as they were. While recounting the drama of glowing ectoplasm or floating guitars might seem ridiculous, and mostly is, to constantly dismiss the overblown and questionable nature of these reports seems somewhat pointless and occasionally in poor taste, suggesting that all who came before us were foolish and credulous rather than insightful, driven, or open. And similarly, we'll be looking at methodologies, claims, and immediate reactions, rather than the finer points of theology or modern spiritualist beliefs. So most sitters will temporarily remove their sense of self and agency and suspend it within the spiritualist arena, quietening their minds and ego at the request of the medium. Energy, a term used loosely and seemingly at random by sitters, mediums, and general believers alike, is an intangible necessity throughout any means of spirit contact. The presence of sitters, being people under the same roof in the same room, is often regarded as more than enough to welcome spirits. However, intention and will is more overused as an additional means of calling out to the afterlife. This belief in energy as a necessity in seance has been carried throughout modern spiritualism, so from early rapping seances where messages were knocked out by unseen hands, through to contemporary paranormal investigators who would conduct a seance as a building block as a part of their evening's programming. In the traditional late Victorian seances, sitters in a private seance would be traditionally of mixed genders and ideally equally divided to balance the energy of the room. If a medium should possess only the weakest of psychic links at a sitting, a circle of focused intention can be refreshed by direct contact between sitters, namely hand-holding. Now, writing in 1935, Harry Boddington explained this energy necessity between sitters and mediums in trance states in relation to spirit control, saying, by merely holding a medium's hands in his own, he can often resolve a partial control into a complete success. The effect of holding a medium's hand inside the ordinary circle intensifies the power locally. So Boddington and others use the terms mediumship, conductorship, and sitter as sort of three tiers of seance spectatorship. A basic sitter is simply someone of little experience at a seance. A conductor is a very experienced sitter with a potent psychic energy who offers themselves as like an additional energy boost to the medium, who is top of the pile with this extra spiritual ability. Offering up evidence of trance mediumship, whereby a spirit could be channeled into and control the medium's body, as proof of the human's ego the human ego's control of spiritual energy, and this was regarded as weak-willed. Sorry, it was regarded that weak-willed and capricious specimens were not wise choices in the seance room or in the wider trance arena, either as sitters or as mediums themselves. So seance rooms were far more cliquey than we ever really like to admit. So according to Boddington, the ideal sitter should have, a quote, sufficient experience to not lose his head at unexpected happenings, but must be sufficiently magnetic to assist and encourage. So the more time one spends in seances and studying psychic law, the more potent one's magnetic energy and positive influence may become. So this view of the human body as a type of battery vibrating with unseen forces was a development that was made upon earlier mesmerist beliefs, where theories of animal magnetism were popularized as a way to potentially explain the very nature of life and consciousness. By harnessing and manipulating this energy, sometimes referred to as magnetic fluid or vital force, it could be altered by magnetic healers who could then influence physical health and mental well-being. With magnetism and mesmerism preceding spiritualism, there are many parallels to be found with claims of spiritual powers, like the touching of hands as a means to increase energy, and also the importance of spiritually energetic helpers. Many magnetists believed that energy moved, quote, more freely from the palms of the hands and at the fingertips than at any other part of the body. And Miss Chandos Lee Hunt's 1885 work, with a very snappy title, which is Private Instructions in the Seance and Art of Organic Magnetism, summarises these similar powers very well, showing this developing belief in the measurable energy and power of magnetism, this unseen human spiritual force. And she said, magnetism is the vital force emanating from the organic soul of man and is directed by his voluntary and involuntary powers. It is to be recognized in the expression of physical, mental, and moral strength. A magnetic healer who links his organic soul, vital force, or healing magnetism with the patient's organic soul force with the same magnetic intention of clearing out disease, then results can be found. The patient works involuntarily, the magnetizer voluntarily. So essentially, touching hands in seance circles was not a spiritualist or a strictly paranormal invention. Hand-holding to increase psychic power or vital force, isn't any grand impropriety, even for the 19th century. But for this normalization of unmarried or unchaperoned men and women touching one another, the physical realm of the seance really quickly snowballed down the decades. So what was once perhaps like a frisson of touching fingertips quickly became something quite different in several Victorian and Edwardian seance rooms, where a subversion of gender, social, and sexual norms was nurtured under a banner of psychology and parapsychology and world-famous phenomena. And I find that there's no better example to give of this snowballing, not snowboarding, that's a very different type of seance, snowballing, very touchy and very sexual type of seance. So well into the 1940s, female spiritualist mediums endured differing levels of examination prior to entering a seance room, if that seance was under the examination of a body, such as like the SPR or an independent research group. This investigation of the female body was a means of determining whether the medium was fraudulently producing phenomena by smuggling items into the room with her. This was most common in cabinet seances, where women were tasked with examining the clothing and sometimes underclothes of mediums about to perform a seance. And while a medium commands a room, their body transcends themselves and it moves away from its original ownership and expectation. A female medium in a trance is denied a sense of self because she's superseded by this other that inhabits her, this spirit that inhabits her. Conventions of politeness, morals, and societal norms are put aside thanks to the sense of scientific, investigative othering, where women may be physically investigated, stripped, restrained. So the medium's body becomes this tool to be examined, completely free from conventions of decency. A report from a turn-of-the-century séance explains this suspension in societal norms as the ladies are invited into the cabinet to disrobe the medium, and in later instances, the ladies at her séances are allowed to thoroughly examine her clothing and her person. Similarly, in an account of a séance led by the iconic Mrs. Guppy in 1872, it's recorded that first the room was searched by the gentleman while Mrs. Guppy was being undressed and redressed in the presence of Mrs. Trollope, very unfortunate surname, every article of her dress being closely examined. A séance from 1868 further explores this eroticism and sexual politics of séance, especially in terms of materialized spirits. After being called to a materialized spirit within a cabinet séance, a young man was recorded as going forward nearly to the curtain and is whispered to, embraced, and very audibly kissed, and the spirit then goes back behind the curtain but reappears again for a moment to exchange some more kisses. So questions of gender arise, and the possibilities of same-sex interactions are introduced in accounts of the same medium, where a similar performance is gone through with another sitter, a young woman who is so excited by these kisses that she nearly faints away, the kissing being very animated and prolonged. But that all seems rather mundane compared to our Eva. So Eva Carrier, as she was known, or Eva C. or Martha Broad, she was a physical medium, at the turn of the century, and did not hide behind spirit manifestation to explore her sexuality or her sexual proclivities. In doing so, she was arguably afforded more bodily autonomy and power than most mediums working at the same time as her, intimidating many of those who attended her sittings, as she was notoriously incessant in bringing nudity and overly aggressive sexual motions into the séance room. Eva was often referred to as perverse and neurotic. She would conduct séances naked, she'd strip and run around the room, she'd have sex with her female lover in the séance space or engage in sexual activities with attending audience members. Some mediums endured examinations. However, Eva insisted upon it and frequently closed her spiritual efforts, apparently, with the insistence of a full internal examination in full view of the assembled sitters, both men and women of the mobile classes. While many séance rooms offered a positive and mildly subversive experience for the sitters, many of Eva's séances were an assault on the senses and transformed the darkened séance room into a threatening space, where sitters would be either on high alert for her movements or watching keenly like a peep show or strange, sexy, spiritual car crash. Now, séances, along with meetings, services, and just general spiritualist gatherings, all traditionally began with a hymn or a song, as it was believed that singing was, I quote, essential in the promotion of harmony, with harmony not just being a musical term, but being an interchangeable term for positive energy. And in creating a musical harmony, the room was prepared and primed for spirit contact. Most of these songs at spiritualist meetings were established Christian hymns that found a second home within spiritualist churches, or were existing Christian hymns with altered spiritualist lyrics. As these hymns, in tune, if not lyrical content, were well known to most sitters, the rousing and somewhat solemn nature of readying a séance room could be seen as an act of spell casting. To many new visitors to the séance room, the alteration of existing hymns could be interpreted as an inversion of the established church, although many Christian communities did manage to marry the two belief systems. And they ultimately set an example of an excitable or an uneasy tone for the preceding séance, depending on how people took this music. And so they cultivated an appropriate atmosphere and anticipated certain reactions prior to the seance itself. There are many instances of spirit mediums channeling the spirits of long-dead composers to produce unique performances of new works from old souls. From young American Victorian girls who were, I quote, daily influenced by spirits whom all skilled musicians recognise by their graphic and peculiar style, through to British dinner ladies of the 1960s who channeled Liszt into their living rooms. However, these bear less influence on the sensory scene setting of the seance room than other more simplistic methods of spirit contact. I quote, spiritual voices, when not directly channeled and spoken by mediums, often emitted through trumpets or via direct voice mediumship, where a disembodied spirit voice channeled by a medium emerges from a space several feet from their person. So a public demonstration of direct voice mediumship in 1934 by the medium Mrs. Perryman was recorded as follows. When the voice seance began, the lights were switched off. Hymns and an invocation followed, then silence, which was suddenly broken by the thin, piping voice of a little girl. It was Belle, Mrs. Perryman's control. "Hello, I see you. What a funny place," she said. The writer later expressed a wish that one day such seances could be conducted in full light, but no luck yet. Disembodied voices invariably help to ensure a disconcerting environment and further emphasise the legitimacy of both the medium and their abilities due to this seemingly impossible nature of this voice's source. Both the laws of sound and the laws of cause and effect aren't applicable to a room under the control of seance. The effect is discombobulating, and through auditory phenomena, commonly conducted within total darkness, the sitter can reach a state of intense arousal owing to the unpredictability and changing volume of their surroundings. In joining a seance as a sitter and relinquishing control, one hands authority to the medium. As such, all previously acknowledged truths and sensory understandings must adjust to that medium's personal methods and rules within the subverted space. Many spiritualist seances were, and continue to be, conducted in complete darkness. The reasons for this vary, but generally boil down to darkness providing a safer and more comfortable environment for spirits and spiritual phenomena to enter and leave with ease. And as such, most disarming sensory phenomena, including most auditory evidence, was experienced in varying states of sensory deprivation. Should hands be clasped, somewhat disarming the sitter, and vision removed or severely limited, feelings of fear and excitement are substantially heightened, with such emotions creating a shared sense of anticipation or an enduring and powerful reaction. And these sitters may snap or provide very, very intense reactions to anything that happens within the seance room, because this is a form of sensory focusing, as you take it as such. Sorry, my notes of just my handwriting is absolutely horrific. So this darkness-induced sensory deprivation, or sensory focusing, if you take it as such, invariably forms the subconscious decisions, movements, and auditory processing of the sitter. So the whole thing is about manipulation and sensory deprivation. Dark seances were also believed to be an unwavering necessity for materialization and apport seances, where the darkness allowed for a strong spiritual link where spirits could manifest themselves or objects and gifts from the ether. It was also a safety feature for ectoplasmic mediums, who would produce this strange swirling white material from their orifice, let's generally say mouth, let's try and keep it vaguely family friendly, that frequently glowed with a light luminescence. If it were touched or exposed to full light, that ectoplasm, being a physical manifestation of the medium's spirit energy, would snap back into the medium like a coiled spring, causing them immense physical harm. Now, Mina Crandon, who is a very well-known ectoplasmic medium, had a strict rule in place for her own welfare. Investigating scientist Dr. Gustav Geely explained of Crandon that her ectoplasm would dissolve in white light, as it, quote, prevents it being condensed sufficiently to be used. With adequate preparation, the seance room and medium could be readied as to withstand early flash photography without injury to the medium. And to reiterate this very real threat of physical harm, this necessity of preparation and darkness was substantiated by an anecdote of the doctor's in 1930s Voices from Beyond. He said, "You may be interested in knowing that there is a case on record where a white light was turned on by one of the sitters unexpectedly during a psychic manifestation. The ectoplasm being used, apparently issuing from the abdomen of the medium, returned to his body with such force that a large hematoma resulted, and he was ill for weeks." Similarly, interactivity between sitter and medium in a state of ectoplasmic production should be minimal, as so much as touching the ectoplasm could subject the medium to very real physical danger. Dr. Knoll, writing on Mina Crandon, said how her plasm was once touched, and as a result she was very ill for several weeks, losing some 14 or 15 pounds in weight. So while darkness in the seance room could conceal sight and manipulate the perceptions of the other senses, by the latter part of the 19th century, it provided an excellent backdrop for ectoplasm and experiments with luminosity. With manifested ghosts comes a period, particularly in the 1870s to about the 1900s, of luminosity or luminous phenomena conducted within the darkened seance room, where a formative glow-in-the-dark paint was concocted using very strong chemical bases. As ectoplasm was largely produced from the medium's mouth and gullet, alongside this dramatic physical phenomena, there would be this really potent and strong chemical smell that would be joined by the natural acidic smell of stomach bile. Many magicians turned spiritualist exposers were aware of this manufactured luminosity, and they could identify its usage and its branding very easily. David P. Abbott, a great American magician, wrote in 1909, saying of ectoplasm that, "I knew that the lights were a piece of gauzy silk dyed with a preparation containing Balmain's luminous paint." As luminosity became more commonplace within the seance room, dyed fabric, whether for use in the manufacture of ectoplasm or manifested spirits, was further developed and modified. So this was in order to try and hide its true consistency, as many of the components, which could include methylated spirits or varnish, had really powerful and unpleasant smells that could also have serious effects on the respiratory systems of the sitters. So they could experience sickness, dizziness, and, as I said, the aforementioned respiratory problems. As such, fraudulent mediums would develop their own recipes for use in the seance room or on the stage, with Abbott citing one solution as follows: 1 jar of Balmain's luminous paint, 1/2 pint Demar varnish, 1 pint odorless benzene, 50 drops of lavender oil. All must be mixed together, kept thin, and the work done very rapidly. I'm aware I've probably missed a lot of jazzy slides. So there we go. Oh, there's some darkness. That's all wonderful and authentic. Dark seances. Mina Crandon, she's having a bad day. There's a big quote. Oh God, I've missed loads. There we are. Luminosity. There's David P. Abbott with some of the manufactured spirits. And there's his recipe: 1 jar of Balmain's luminous paint, 1/2 pint Demar varnish, 1 pint odorless benzene, 50 drops of lavender oil. That's a lot of lavender oil, and I'm not sure as it would really take the edge off. So the caustic was so often covered by the sweet and the recognizable. In the seance room, flowers and floral scents hid a multitude of deceptions, while further legitimizing the belief that scents such as lavender signaled the arrival of a positive spirit. So fraudulent mediums were manufacturing these links that we've taken through to spiritual beliefs today. Regardless of ectoplasm's true roots, many ectoplasmic seances show production of the material and a tethering to the medium by a fine cord. As such, there are many parallels to be drawn between these ectoplasmic structures and their similarity to embryological structures, once more transforming the seance room into a protective, matriarchal womb and safe space. when spirits may be communicating through muffled or thrown voices, or simply hearing unclear noises within a seance room, a creak, a sigh, a knock. All of these can be interpreted as being incredibly significant to a sitter or as pertinent communications. A voice heard across the room may appear to say different things to different sitters, or sound exactly like someone's loved one or a known public figure. Other noises can similarly be interpreted in different ways depending on the subconscious processing of the sitter. It's through auditory pareidolia or apophenia that our brain seeks to find order or recognizable patterns in stimuli. It's the same innate human need to map and find order in chaos that causes us to see shapes in clouds, in ghosts in photographs of smoke. Because by removing sight and focusing the remaining senses, sitters can be overwhelmed by experiences with only minor triggers needed. The same sensations of fear and excitement can be fear and excitement in sound can be replicated with more standardized instances of fraudulent psychic hot and cold readings, whereby a medium would throw out common threads until someone grabbed on, believing that it had a personal significance to them, or whether a medium was acting on pre-existing information. A perceived hit of correct information from a medium directly alters the way in which we interact immediately with our surroundings and with our own bodies. Our hearts race, our skin prickles, we're suddenly very aware of temperatures, of sounds that we swore weren't there before, the feel of our own skin, and we unconsciously crane forwards to strengthen this spiritual intercourse, as if this closeness will incite more spectral phenomena. I'm not sure if we have another slide here. There we are. Sudden and violent noises within the seance room didn't always take the form of voices, but commonly of musical instruments. Musical instruments played a large role in seances across the world, as they were played by unseen hands hovering above the heads of sitters, or were just simply thrown, either from a spirit cabinet or just in darkness across a room. An 1879 seance with Mr. Jesse Shepherd at the Ballarat Psychological Association began with a rousing song from the sitters before a piano accompaniment was played, and, I quote, "the guitar at the same time floated round above the heads of the company. This quickly descended into a cacophony of sounds, as the instruments were joined by several voices who spoke into the ears of sitters before the medium himself was engaged in conversation, then was compelled to sing an aria. As the guitar rested on a lady's head, it was joined by a soprano voice that confirmed with a gentle pat that it was indeed her deceased sister." And back to one of my favourite women of all time, Mrs. Guppy. So the psychical phenomena exhibited by British medium, Mrs. Elizabeth Agnes Guppy, encompasses many sensory fields and demonstrates an extreme degree of cultivation and sensory control of the seance room, one that was unrivalled by most of her contemporaries. Mrs. Guppy asserted her dominance and rule over the seance room, firstly, by her large frame. Reports of her spiritualist phenomena were rarely discussed without a reference to her large stature, which led her to be both mocked and feared, clearly she's got to me as well, by investigators and believers alike. Now, Mrs. Guppy was a pioneer of materialisation mediumship and became a sensation of the London scene by summoning apports to her seance table. Now, apports, as I'm sure most of you know already, refers to anything produced by spiritual means from the ether. So some mediums were able to ask for heavenly gifts that would be deposited in darkened rooms onto the seance table. Largely, these would be things like flowers or little trinkets, items that could be easily secreted upon a person, but largely presented as proof of a solid and unbreakable psychic link between medium and spirit world. Apports could appear in an assault on the senses, producing large bangs as they landed on the table. They could also produce strong smells and uneasy and curious physical interactions of touch, as sitters would fumble to redress their relationship with their darkened environment, which now played host to unseen objects or unseen creatures. Guppy's apports were world famous in their size and diversity. She produced fresh flowers, butterflies. We got another slide? There we are. Fresh flowers, butterflies, whole shrubs, miniature eels, miniature trees and full-size eels, starfish, lobsters, puppies, kittens, exotic smells, and mountains of jewels. It's a bit like the Generation game, really, at her seance tables. Described later in the Journal of Psychic Science, apports are peculiar, as they do not appear before the eye, but wait until attention is diverted for a moment. There were many studies made of Mrs. Guppy's seances, which often included larger numbers of sitters. One seance of the 1870s, 18 sitters wished for different fruit, and each fruit arrived thudding onto the seance table in order of will, from bananas to a dozen damsons, a slice of candied pineapple, and a large bunch of beautiful raisins. The visual and sensory indulgence of Guppy's seance was quite overwhelming, and also introduced taste and consumption into the sensory seance room, transforming it into a real spiritual ritual. Guppy was also very well known for alarming and unsettling apports, the arrival of which would terrify sitters with their sound and impact. Now, in a seance with the Florence Spiritual Society, a noise was heard as if the chandelier had fallen down. When the room was illuminated once more, a block of ice measuring a square foot was seen to have hurled itself onto the table. As Mrs. Guppy's hands were commonly held during apport production, many regarded this and her to be irrefutable proof of supernatural powers. While seance rooms, we haven't got to him yet, go away, Charles. While seance rooms were largely regarded as powerful but ultimately safe spaces, apports ultimately subverted this safety, as escalation in their nature brought about a real danger of physical harm into the seance room. By the turn of the century, manifestation mediums such as the Australian Charles Bailey, there he is, had moved from manifesting large quantities of raining gravel to then manifesting Central American artifacts such as tomahawks and scalps, and even ancient Babylonian cuneiform tablets. He would ultimately gain his greatest infamy through the production of living apports, such as jungle sparrows, crabs, and turtles, and ultimately brought a, I quote, 18-inch long shark into the seance room, at another time a 30-inch snake. Extreme acts that ultimately transformed his seance space not only into a sensory experience, but also a very fearful circus for the sitters, and obviously, sadly, harmed the unfortunate animals supplied. Bailey later minimised the nature of his living apports and mainly produced things like birds in the seance room, continuing his career in apports for well over 40 years. And sadly, again for the birds, I'll let you guess where he was secreting most of those towards the end of his career. But let's say whoever was doing his colonoscopies would have had a hell of a story to tell over dinner that night. But as frightening and as destabilising as a table covered in artefacts and snakes is, Mrs. Guppy achieved a far more terrifying feat in a dark seance. Let's see if I've got a slide for this one. There we go. In June of 1871, Mrs. Guppy levitated from her house in Highbury to a seance table in Bloomsbury, literally. Reportedly, a seance group in Bloomsbury asked the spirit world for an apport, something large. Someone jokingly asked for Mrs. Guppy, to which another commented, "Good Lord, I hope not, she's one of the biggest women in London." Quote, "In an instant, somebody called out, 'Good God, there's something on my head.' Simultaneously, with a heavy bump on the table, came one or two screams. A match was instantly struck, and there was Mrs. Guppy standing on the centre of the table. She had one arm over her eyes, with a pen in her hand and an account book in the other, which was hanging by her side. When she came round, she seemed very much affected and began to cry." Now, scent, and Mrs. Guppy's flight aside, scent is usually the first and last spiritual manifestation within the seance room. This is really what bookended the traditional late 19th century seance. It signalled the arrival and the departure of spirit. Scent, hearkening the visitation of a spirit, is something we frequently hear today when people speak warmly of smelling grandma's perfume or granddad's tobacco. Scent is, of course, a very powerful and evocative tool. It's deeply linked to an individual's memory and quite often social comforts. Through the use or positive weaponization of scents, powerful emotional bonds are created within the seance space and mentally legitimize the arrival and the presence of spiritual forces. Considering that seance rooms are often inhabited by those who are grieving or devoted to spiritual development, establishing these positive olfactory bonds is integral for the success and the longevity of both the seance room itself, but also the relationships between the sitters and the central medium, and the sitters and their established belief in the afterlife or with spiritual communication. So powerful and potent is the power of scent in the spiritual sphere that it not only welcomed and announced spirits, but it also heightened and increased the pre-existing powers of the medium. Perfume used within a spiritualist context was also believed to support thought transference between the sitters and the mediums. In a 1901 guide to magnetism in seance, it reads that if the operator inhales a perfume at a sufficient distance from the subject, the sensitive will describe and frequently name the perfume as conveyed to him by this sympathetic community of smell. Alongside raps, table moving, musical sounds, and apports, scent was a commonly accepted and anticipated indicator of a close spiritual presence. William Stainton Moses was a British medium and cleric and the co-founder of the College of Psychic Studies, and while his claims of powerful mediumship and spirit phenomena are the subject of heated debate and dismissal today, his records offer up detailed accounts of common sense usage across a great number of seance rooms within the UK. Explaining commonalities in British seances, he wrote that scents of various descriptions were always brought to the circle, the most common being musk, verbena, new mown hay, and one unfamiliar odour which we were told was called spirit scent. Sometimes breezes heavy with perfume swept round the circle, and at other times quantities of liquid musk, etc., would be poured on the hands of sitters and by request onto our handkerchiefs. At the close of a séance, scent was often found to be oozing out of the medium's head, and the more it was wiped away, the stronger and more plentiful it became. This indescribable spirit scent was often reported throughout Victorian periodicals, but was very rarely pinned down as possessing recognisable tones, commonly described as simply being lovely. It was often accompanied by a similarly named spirit light that would illuminate parts of a manifesting spirit. However, this spirit light was often regarded as being a mixture of oil and phosphorus, quite the dangerous and unstable concoction that was often extinguished when it became too hot in the spirit hands, having to return to the medium's sphere to cool it. And rather than obtaining phosphorus from a match producer, as it's very flammable, it was often claimed to be obtained by the spirit from the bodies of the mediums and the sitters. Now, spirit scent aside, the earliest records of recognisable scents and perfumes in spiritualist seances began around the 1860s and continued in this same vein for many years. The most common scents recognised by sitters, writers and reporters were, and you have to excuse my pronunciation, I'm not a perfumer, anethol, vanilla and musk. It was also in the 1860s that, conveniently, the Western world began to produce its first recognisable synthetic scents that were aimed at the mass market. The first group of these scents to be lab-produced were cinnamaldehyde, anethol in anise oil, I should have done more GCSEs in science, benzaldehyde, villanin, coumarin, and lastly, musk, our old favourite musk. These seance rooms stank of it. Arguably, the first synthetically produced scent was nitrobenzene or myrrhine oil in 1834, which was a yellowy oil with a bitter almond scent. but this very quickly proved to be quite a skin irritant, so would have been a risky addition to any seance room later. Organic chemists and perfumers were able to identify compounds in essential oils and recreate these molecules in lab conditions, making many popular scents available for use by a wider socio-economic group, and also able to be affordably purchased in larger quantities. So when you see this wave of pleasant scents in seance room, it's across all classes of seances. There's from private right through to public. A few decades had passed after this initial development, and then by 1895, organic chemists were producing synthetic versions of most floral scents, particularly rose, jasmine, and lavender, all common, very spirit-adjacent scents. This democratization of scent undoubtedly fed into this rise of scented seances within the burgeoning field of spiritualism and private mediumship, where conditions could be manipulated to provide a unique sensory experience. And with these powerful floral scents, they would legitimize the spiritual prowess of the medium, while the non-spectral world was able to enjoy the introduction of scented soaps. Mediums and spiritualists found these scents to be a far more powerful sensory tool than any perfumer or perfume house had previously thought. Curiously, slight-smelling liquids concealed on the top of mediums' heads were not uncommon. Some fraudulent mediums wishing to read the contents of closed envelopes would soak their hair with an ethyl alcohol and then place the sealed envelope to their head, briefly wetting the outside of it, rendering it translucent. They could then read the contents while leaving it sealed, and then return the envelope back to the table when it had returned to its former state. Perfumed liquids were sometimes unwelcome phenomena in seance rooms, particularly to female sitters whose clothing was rather more elaborate and delicate than their male counterparts. What was not sprinkled by spirits in circuits of fine droplets could be poured onto their person as an unexpected start to a session. Speaking of a seance in 1874, one Mr. Percival wrote that, "Finally, we were told that a new manifestation would be attempted, and that we were to prepare for it by joining hands and holding the palms upward. In this position we waited for 2 or 3 minutes, and then I felt a stream of liquid scent poured out, as it were, from the spout of a teapot, which fell onto one side of my hand and ran down upon the table." Frederick Myers, a founder of the SPR, explained the use of scent in his seances, that this harmonizing is effected in our circle by means of perfumes and waves of cool, scented air. The seance room indicated that it has reached prime spiritual maturity when the room is pervaded by odours of subtle and delicate or strong perfume. In other spirit circles, such as those led by Moses or his contemporary Myers, the combination of music, spirit light, and spirit scent was seen as a spiritual method by which the medium and spirit realm would calm and welcome sitters to the seance room, soothing their minds and letting them throw aside thoughts of other matters. To set a scene of a late 19th century seance held by William Moses, there we are, we can see the different sensory aspects of the medium there, that it's not simply calling out to ghosts and seeing what comes through. The whole thing is very much cultivated. So let's go back, let's miss her out, shall we? There we go. So from William Moses, the chair which the stranger, medium, occupies is surrounded by luminous haze, from which issues the perfume and very frequently wet scent, being more or less pungent according to conditions, and sprinkled from the ceiling at the same time. If a new intelligence is to communicate or special honour to be paid to a chief, the room by perfumes which grow stronger as the spirit enters. This scenting of the room in which we are about to meet will sometimes commence many hours before we begin. Indeed, when we have been in the country, far from the polluted atmosphere of smoke and dirt, charged with the nameless odours that London breeds, the air of the seance room is always laden with perfumes. Sometimes the aroma of a flower from the garden is drawn out, intensified, and insinuated throughout the house. Sometimes the odour is like nothing of this earth's production, ethereal, delicate, and infinitely delightful. Sandalwood used to be a favourite, and rose, verbena, and odours of other flowers have been plentifully used. Much like controlling the light allowed into a séance room, the scent of séance can be used to manipulate sitters into following the social necessities and expectations of a specific attending group. So if sitters were not deemed suitable for a séance, being outspoken, untrustworthy, or visually or socially undesirable to the group, mediums and their compatriots could extend this displeasure in tangible terrestrial ways. While a pleasant scent may be commonplace at most séances, an unwelcome character in the séance circle may inadvertently beckon discomfort into the room. One of Moses's interviewees spoke of how, on certain occasions when conditions are not favourable, the scent is pungent and most painful if it gets into the eye. The illness of one of the sitters will cause the scent to be coarse and pungent. And should a sitter allow light into the dark séance room without permission, should they move without permission or even act against expectations, then they would be promptly removed from the group and their spiritualist social circle. While many séances were domestic spaces transformed for the purposes of spirit contact, their benevolence had firm limits. What could be comforting and transformative, existing in a realm separate from our own, it could just as quickly be unfurled and reappraised as a closed world. Exposing fraudulent mediums would immediately remove an individual from a circle of trust and effectively blacklist them from most local séances and spiritualist groups. So it's little wonder that people like Harry Houdini's female investigators travelled the country armed with suitcases filled with elaborate disguises. Séance is commonly recognised as an important and unstable component of new religions, and it's also the arena for fantastical phenomena, laughable phenomena, and prime for use as a narrative tool in neo-Gothic fiction and horror film production. It's a dramatic and necessary tool in contemporary paranormal investigation and for TV ghost hunters. It brought comfort to the bereaved and academic excitement to researchers, and it also created the ideal environment for the exploitation of the marginalised and the vulnerable. It prolonged emotional distress, and it financially ruined many who kept returning in the hope of a little more spirit scent, a little more touch, and a little more communication with a loved one. But it was also a world within a world. It was lawless and exciting, where working class women could command gatherings of wealthy men, and sexual impropriety was normalised through the caveat of, well, she wasn't a woman then, she was actually a vessel inhabited by a 17th century ghost. The liminal space of the séance room continues to act as this spectral Wild West, where through manipulation of our senses, we can transcend ourselves, and our moral and our ethical confines are removed with just a short hymn, the smell of roses, and an open palm. And that closes my little scent-filled ramble for the evening. And if you'd like to get in touch with me or find anything I do on social media, there are all of my links, and also my Patreon, which is updated minimum of 4 times a week with videos, articles, podcasts, loads of spooky stuff at patreon.com/burials and beyond. Burials and beyond, that is. Clearly I'm emotional at the very thought of it. So thank you all very much for listening. And I'll just stand here and look at you for a bit longer. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be happy to answer any.
Hello there. Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I really enjoyed that. So, in fact, I think our first conversation ever was about Eva C, which I don't normally talk to ladies on my first meeting them about, on the grounds that they might think I was a bit of a weirdo, but I do have a very large selection of old SBR proceedings in my basement. So that's the kind of stuff I grew up with. Right, fantastic. I believe it is traditional. Is Claire here tonight? Don't know if Claire's joined us yet. What a bunch of pervs they were, says Alice. Yeah, that was my major interest in them when I was a younger student. Christian, are you going to handle the questions tonight, or shall I do it? Oh, I can't hear from Christian, so it sounds like it's going to be me.
Sorry, would you mind taking care of it tonight, CJ?
Absolutely, absolutely happy to.
Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. So let's just go through the questions and see who's got what to say. Firstly, I need to find a chat. There it is. And I need to go back up to the top. And I will go down. Some of those mixtures you were suggesting, I wonder if anyone ever tries them nowadays. I mean, they sounded incredibly toxic.
Yeah, a lot of the early ones were I've got I'm fortunate enough to have someone far more intelligent than me in the family. I've got a former chemist in the family. And some of the early experiments using phosphorus, he was saying that it's little wonder that seance rooms weren't really the root of many reports of spontaneous human combustion, because the amount of phosphorus they were chucking all over themselves in an ectoplasm, it was like it was tinderbox waiting to go up.
Well, I mean, white phosphorus, it will burn, it will glow, but it will burn horrendously. It's used as a weapon, not. Right, okay. Yeah, Kieran says most perfumes are based on volatile organic oils or chemicals such as ethanol, methanol, benzene derivatives, acetones mixed with water, based on soluble scented compounds so that the volatiles will evaporate quickly on the skin. They can effectively mask the smell of certain bodily fluids. Surely some of these chemicals would have effects on the brain too, says Jenny Caldwell. I think, well, what do you think? What do you think?
I think, well, it depends on earlier reports. I think with the introduction of early synthetics, that saved a lot of accidents from happening. Yeah. So I do think that with these early synthetic scents and things that were based with that were constructed with a base of things like ethanol, like Christian mentioned, those sort of things I think were foolish and probably unpleasant things to create, but wouldn't have caused that much by way of trauma. But I think when people experimented more with luminosity rather than scent itself, that's when I think there would have been far more accidents, because they were more toxic paint fumes being used in very closed environments and obviously being ingested as well. So just from a let alone from a inhalation, from a respiratory view of things, the gastric issues and certainly the upper GI, upper gastrointestinal issues that could arise from swallowing and regurgitating large amounts of cheesecloth, silk, butter muslin, things like that, coated in such paints. I honestly believe they would have contributed to a lot of early deaths and certainly a lot of esophageal issues.
Yeah,
within
absolutely.
mediums.
I mean, my friend Byron, who's an ASSAP exec, he's an undertaker, and it sounded to me more like some of the embalming solutions more than.
Yes, that's where some of them got these chemicals from. The basic embalming fluid is formaldehyde.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The thing I was going to ask you about, I've completely forgotten what I was going to ask you about now. Sorry, I've lost the chat as well. Where's it gone? Yeah. Other than cloth, are any of the other ingredients or materials that created ectoplasm known? Says Justin Cole.
I think there's loads of lists. A lot of mediums created their own versions of it. There's everything from, like I said, butter muslin, loose. It's a lot of loose weave fabrics. We've got muslin, silk, cheesecloth, chewed up paper. I think Ariva likes quite a bit of chewed up paper. What else? Cotton, and a lot of natural fibres. To be honest, aside from the luminous paint, the creation of ectoplasm was quite an eco-friendly little task as far as home crafts go. Yeah, it was all mainly fabric and paper, as far as I understand it.
I was looking at British luminous paints of the Edwardian period, as you do, trying to look at the chemicals that were used in those. It was actually for something I was writing, and I was surprised that to discover that they were well known and manufactured. But it really didn't sound like something that one would want to eat. I mean, did it not cause your teeth to glow, or how did they get around that kind of problem? The staining effects.
Well, I haven't heard of all the reports I went through, and it's mainly a lot of this is based on periodicals. There's been very little mention of any kind of orthodontic issue or any medical issue directly following phenomena, these sort of sensory phenomena, apart from the last Australian chap who was hiding birds up his bum. And there were quite a few instances of people remarking at a rather more pleasant way than they would do today of how odd his body was and how strangely he was holding himself later in life.
You do win the award for the weirdest line ever issued in an ASSAP webinar.
Oh, thank
you. Chap holding, yeah. Okay. Masculine came from Cheltenham. He lived a few houses from where I'm at the moment, and him and his son dedicated a great deal of their lives to the pursuit of fake mediumship. Long before old what's he called, Houdini started it. It seems to have been quite a fashion amongst the masculines, actually. Have you come across him much? Because I've read his...
directly next to a little mock-up of an old Egyptian hall poster.
His Egyptian hall down in London. Three of his houses in Cheltenham still survive, and one of them, there's the famous account of the haunting. And the thing is that the more I read about masculine, the more, like James Randi, I wonder how much was showmanship and how much he bent the facts to meet his agenda, shall we say. There's a whole complex situation going on there. But anyway, great talk. Can you recommend books specifically on seances in such detail as you've just presented?
I honestly think for the detail of seances, you honestly can't beat periodicals and archives. They're very dry, but personally, my go-to is always David P. Abbott's was it Afternoons with the Spirits? It's his masterwork from like 1909. You can get it either free online or you can get those like big wobbly Amazon reprints of it. And he was a magician, and he spent years traveling all over the States chronicling seances and debunking them. So he brought about so many really important exposures relating to mediums. But from those exposures, then you can retroactively look back at how the things worked. So he would explain how people would use common books and things like the Blue Book of Boston to obtain information for passing fraudulent mediums. So although, like, aside from scholarly stuff, I think David P. Abbott, anything written by a magician at the turn of the century is well worth reading, because that gives you a good sense of exactly what was going on.
The aforementioned masculine as well.
Oh, masculine, of course.
Yeah, where can you find spiritualist journals? I mean, I used to read issues of Light and Two Worlds magazines. I don't know. Yeah, of course you're familiar with those. But where is the other pre-Second World War spiritualist literature now? Is it available online anywhere?
Yeah, the best. There's a massive archive called ASSAP, which is the International Association for the Preservation, of Occult Periodicals.
Oh, fantastic.
So it's IAPSOP.com, and it's just a massive online repository of just PDFs of spiritualist and occult periodicals from like the 1840s. They've got previous ones. They've got a lot of mesmerist PDFs, things like that, really dense, older archival work. It's fantastic. I mean, you will lose, if you've never been on there before, you will lose days of your life to especially reading the letter pages. So, like in this shows how intellectually powerful I am. I love Chat magazine, Take a Break, That's Life, things like that. When you get the top tips where it's like, if your children don't want to go outside, have you considered sticking a sponge to their face and throwing them out a window? They'll love it. This sort of really mental things. that isn't a new thing. Top tips and really horrible letters to the editor were done beautifully by the Victorians. So if you go through ASSAP, go through like Light or The Spiritualist, those really old periodicals, just go straight down to the end, to the letters to the editor. It's fantastic. There are full-blown rows. It's like EastEnders and Love Island, but with ghosts. It's fantastic. So
The
I fully
Lady
recommend.
has occasional, I think it's a Victorian journal called The Lady, a domestic quarterly. They both, when they're not going on about the proper methods of disciplining daughters, and other correspondence that's clearly written by men and is nothing whatsoever to do with what it appears to be on the thing. They quite often have ghost stories and spiritualist stuff then. But Victorian journals are hard to acquire, so online sources. And of course,
Yeah.
ASSAP, it used to be free. Is it still free?
It is still free. Yeah, there's
Yeah,
a few
so-
things that are missing from there that you can get if you've got academic accreditation through like JSTOR and things like that. But pretty much everything you could ever want is reasonably on ASSAP. I don't know how they're still going, just from the bandwidth that I've rinsed from them.
Yeah.
But it's a great resource.
I suspect that they have wealthy donors. There are still a lot of occultists out there, and I'm quite surprised at how many occult bookshops still function. I found one in Cheltenham many years ago, but they seem to be all over the country still. Here we go. Kate's personal views. Okay, Kirk Mackey asks, what are Kate's personal beliefs regarding the legitimacy of seances? Would you like to say, or would you prefer not to say?
No, I can say. I think they've changed a hell of a lot over the last decade or so. I think, like most people who had, admittedly, I had very unexplained experiences as a child, and that's what led me down this sort of paranormal investigative path. But as I've been more actively around paranormal investigators, mediums, people like that, I think I've been a lot more objective and a lot more removed in my approach to those sort of things. So I'd say seances, I'm fascinated by them. I'd say 80-90% of the phenomena is consciously or subconsciously produced by humans, by human control. But I do cling on to that tiny little percentage that I think there's something in there. So I'm skeptical, but in a constructive way, not in a, throwing all my toys out the pram and being unpleasant about it. I find them really fascinating experiences. And, as transformative sensory personal experiences, I think they're very important. I think people can get something very powerful and very, very needed, something that's transformative or healing for them from seances. Whether or not that's from spiritual means or not is immaterial. It's what the individual gains from them. So I'm happily on the fence, I'd say.
It's interesting what you say about seances changing, because when I first started off in the business, so to speak, in the 90s, I knew an old school mediumship researcher called Gary Skidmore. And Gary was in his 60s or 70s then. I hope he's still alive and is listening to this, but I don't know if he is. It's probably unlikely, actually, given how many years on we are now. But we were good friends for many years, and he was an industrial chemist and a researcher, and he'd investigated the Leslie Flint and a lot of classic 1940s and 50s mediums. And he didn't recognise what my friends were doing on ghost hunts when they sat down and called out, as they'd say nowadays, the most haunted thing, as being anything to do with spiritualism. To him, spiritualism was a religious thing that took place in a constrained institutional kind of setting. Seances had certain things which had to happen. There had to be a designated medium, etc., etc. So do you think it's just been a radical deinstitutionalization of the seance, a democratization that's led to a kind of ad hoc seance? Is that the change you're seeing?
I think there's been a clear split off between recognizable spiritualist seance and what is called seance by paranormal investigators and communities of that ilk. But I think certainly, I don't want to sound like an old woman just shouting at technology and developments. But I do feel that the power of social media and just media as a whole on the proliferation of the need for immediate entertainment has had, alongside the what's the word? My mind's gone. Well, the less religious. God, what's the word? Oh my God, my brain's gone.
Secular.
Basically, while the UK has become less religious, secular.
Yeah.
This whole thing's been full of sibilant words, and I can't remember secular.
Yeah.
There's the secularization of the UK, alongside the proliferation of the power of social media, I think has contributed enormously to the split off in seance methods. So while you've still got spiritualist churches, the SNU, that whole structure still functioning with traditional seances and mediumship circles, and then there's even more split offs from that with people that are trying to bring back ectoplasmic and cabinet seances. I do feel that we so often, just as humans, connect with what's in front of us, and what has been in front of us for so long, especially on social media, is this very dialed down sort of have a go attitude to spirit contact that we call seances. But I think there's a big divide between what is recognizably a spiritualist seance and what is a paranormal investigator's seance today. And certainly people like Leslie Flint, who I love, by the way. I got a little bit obsessed with Leslie Flint a couple of years ago, particularly his chats with his with Oscar Wilde and his spirit control, who spoke like the Artful Dodger for no apparent reason. I don't think he would have a place in contemporary spiritual seance. Contemporary paranormal investigator seance, but he certainly would have a place in contemporary spiritualist seance. If that makes any sense.
So there's a distinction between, say, the Stansted mediums from the Arthur Findlay tradition and the Stuart Alexanders and the Colin Fry's and the other sort of new wave physical mediums, and then you've got the Skull Group and the energy mediums, but they're all very different to the ghost hunting, most haunted inspired mediums. But we find exactly the same thing in Wicca. I mean, when I was young, there were coven Wiccans who were part of a tradition, and they passed their traditions from one generation to another. And then we had the kind of Sabrina the Teenage Witch generation, and witchcraft became something that became deinstitutionalized democratically. People just did it themselves. DIY Wicca, I guess. So I think it's much the same. Maybe it's the same in Christianity. I don't know. I've not noticed it, but I certainly have come across parachurch organizations who, while they claim to be Roman Catholic or Protestant, just do their own thing and make it up as they go along. But
yeah, I think with that is things like the Alpha Course certainly changed many Anglican churches. So perhaps it could be seen as with contemporary seance that I don't know if it is a democratization. I don't know. I think it's just factions after factions. It's like the 19th century wave of new religions again. It's principles just splitting off again and again, but more generationally, like you say with Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and I'd say the Craft arguably had a greater influence in splitting off Wicca and all of that in the 90s. And Charmed, yeah, and Buffy even. I'd argue that Buffy had a big point there. So I'd say the splits are more generational rather than religious.
there was also mediumship went through that as well, because you had Jennifer Love Hewitt playing a medium in, I forget what it was called. What was it called?
Ghost something, wasn't it?
It was on every Ghost Whisperer or something like that. It was
Ghost Whisperer.
Yeah, it was on in the afternoons because I occasionally caught it when I came in, and I was just shocked that it was. There was also Stephen Volk's, of course, classic Afterlife, which again looked in a different way at mediumship, and so on. But yeah, so this is something that is taking place across our culture, whether we like it or not, whether we want to celebrate the old-fashioned and the esoteric. The early luminous paint would have possibly been radioactive and therefore carcinogenic. Yeah. Probably if it had radium involved. Let's just keep going down. Keeping birds in the bum, says Christian Lander. But enough of your personal habits, Christian. We've told you before. Birds up the bum, says Robert Stanton. This really is, I mean, turning into what? Did they lose teeth or die young? Oh, don't say that. Don't say that, Emma. My house used to be used for the purpose of painting radium watches. So I'm not joking about this. It was just down the road, but my house was one of the houses that the workers lived in. They had a clockmakers and they used to paint the dials for radium clocks. And I found out when the guy who owns next door found the advert in an old newspaper and said, "Did you know that the street used to be used for housing by the radium clockmakers of the high street?" Thanks for telling me that, Dave. That was DC.
Yeah.
He's here now, probably still here.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure if radium-based paint was ever involved in ectoplasmic production. I certainly haven't found any record of radium
It's
paint being used.
It seems unlikely.
Yeah, it does seem unlikely when there were far easier and cheaper ways to produce
Much
luminosity.
cheaper.
But with ectoplasmic mediums, compared to people like the radium girls who would spend all day just licking paint and directly ingesting it, I don't know if any ectoplasmic medium would have ingested as much in such frequency as they would cause very long-term orthodontic damage. So I'm not too sure there. But I'll look into it.
I hate to think what the uncanny community are doing with the discussion of Australian gentlemen with birds up their bums. But I'm afraid I'm going to have to leave in a moment because I've got another meeting tonight. But I can't thank you enough for an absolutely wonderful webinar, a great talk, and maybe we will still see the return of the traditional seance. Maybe we should stage one and have Kate perform a seance at the next ASSAP conference. So, you're part of the UK Paranormal. What's happening? Tell us what's got the latest with UK Paranormal while we're here.
With the UK Paranormal Society.
Yeah.
I am no longer involved, I'm afraid.
Sorry. Okay, I shouldn't have asked.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I know they launched last year. I was involved while they were getting things together. I did a lot of proofreading and writing and things like that. But yes, they're completely different group of people now. But they seem to be doing good things. So I definitely agree with the premise of their ethical purposes. But I'm not entirely sure what they're up to nowadays.
No, I've got no idea at all, but that was why I thought I'd ask, because I just hadn't heard from them for a while.
I was relieved that you didn't ask how many budgies I've stuck up my bum, but thank you for just asking that instead.
No, I just whatever you got to at the Banshee on a Wednesday night is entirely between you and the goth community. Budgies, did they? I suppose it was lucky. How did he get an 18-inch shark from
I don't think everything was. I don't know why I'm being so prudish. I don't know why everything was supposedly stored up his arse. But I think birds were quite easy. Everything else you could have, when people pull like rabbits out of hats, you still have pockets and sleeves and things. Not everything has to be rectally clenched.
Not everything has to be rectally clenched.
No.
And on that line, we will end tonight's occupation of 19th century mediumship. So thank you very much to the wonderful Dr. K, and keep safe, everyone. God bless. Please send the complaints to Kate, not to me. And to the 90, and if you can, actually send them to Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I believe is Minister for the 19th century and is therefore entirely responsible for these unusual concepts. Have a good night, everyone. Take care. Good night. The uncanny community are going to be absolutely wetting themselves at the anal clenching of the 18-inch sharks. Good night, everyone. Take care.